pray that you would bless the reading and the preaching and teaching of your word today. And God, we just pray for your presence here today. In the name of Jesus, amen. You may be seated. Almost got taken out there, didn't I? Right in the middle of prayer. That's how I want to go, is while praying. Is how I want to go. Good morning, my name's Brad. You know who I am. Those of you joining us online. Randall, if you're out there driving, keep your eyes on the road. And I don't know if anybody else who's traveling today, we've got the verdicts on the way to a wretched place, JRTC. I've never personally spent any time there. We almost lost another person to JRTC this week. But please, Jana confided she was going to be on a 12-hour bus ride today. And it's like, I can't think of much worse than a 12-hour Greyhound ride. So anyway, if you have your copy of God's Word, we're going to be in Genesis chapter 32 as we continue our series entitled First Love. Our series entitled First Love. And so we are like the church in Ephesus, and we are remembering our first love, and we are repenting where we have forgotten our first love. And if you're anything like me, we need to repent because we have forgotten our first love. I forget my first love just about every single day. And then we went to Emmaus, the road to Emmaus, and we are heeding the command of Jesus to go to Moses and the prophets to testify about Jesus. And much like Cleopas and his friend, it said their hearts burned inside of them. And my prayer is that our hearts would burn inside of us. I pray that our hearts are already burning inside of us. I pray that, or maybe there's a spark in our hearts, and we can continue to throw fuel on the spark as we wade through Moses and the prophets, and we see how they testify to Jesus. And then we went to Genesis 3:15, the proto-evangelium, the first preaching of the gospel. And in looking to Jesus, we saw our own helplessness. And then we went to Genesis 12 and the first covenant. We saw the impossibility of Jesus, that Jesus is impossible, but he is made possible. And it's just amazing to us. And then last week we saw Hagar, the slave girl, cowering by the spring in the wilderness. And we saw that Jesus is all sufficient. And today I pray that we would see that Jesus is relentless as we get into Genesis 32. Now, this is an unusual account, and Joe talked about it some, this wrestling match between Jacob and God. And you all, those of you that are here, maybe joining us online, I'm actually preaching to myself today. You guys just happen to get to listen a little bit. And I think maybe Joe was preaching to himself a little bit up here. But I'm talking to myself today, and hopefully you all will benefit by listening as we talk about this particular wrestling match. I watched a lot of wrestling over the last 3 or 4 months. Maybe you've seen some of my social media posts, but I have a wrestler in my home, 2 of them actually, but Memphis is a wrestler. And he's a pretty good wrestler. He's actually a pretty natural wrestler. He's kind of squirrely anyway, pretty agile, and he's really tenacious. He's he does not give up, and he's really agile, pretty strong, and he's lifting, he's getting stronger. He's getting ready to pass me up pretty soon here. It's just a matter of time. And so this was his first full year of wrestling. He wrestled for the middle school team last year. Halfway through the year, he dislocated his kneecap. It was a gruesome injury right in the middle of a match, and so that truncated his wrestling season last year. So he's in 9th grade this year. He attends Amy's Academy of Excellence, and he wrestles for Clarksville High on the JV team. And he made it all the way through the year. I was praying that he would just make it through the year without his kneecap falling off again. He did. And he had a pretty good year wrestling. He did. He won his first match in a pin, and from there, he just did really well. I named him the Crippler. I called him the Crippler. And he was pinning guys. Right, left. He was defeating dudes all over the place. Now, he won and lost some. He lost a couple of matches here and there. But most of his matches he won, and he won quite a few of them by pinning his opponent. And again, he just, over and over again, every match he won some tournaments. He got in 2nd place. And then we get to this one particular tournament a couple of months ago. And again, he starts out strong. He's just crushing dudes. Like the first 3 matches, he's pinning guys in the first match. He's just putting guys down. And you can see he's getting stronger and stronger, and he's getting more and more confident. And he actually made it all the way to the finals of this pretty large tournament. And again, we were very impressed to see him go that far. We're going to come back to the Crippler. come back. We'll land that plane here in just a minute. We'll leave you hanging. I won't spoil what happens in the finals. But let's talk about this particular wrestling match between Jacob and God. And again, Joe talked about it a little bit. Let me set it up for you. So Jacob is the grandson of Abraham. He's the son of Isaac. He is the child of promise. God had made this promise to Abraham, and it was necessary that Isaac be born, that Jacob be born, to continue this amazing promise that God had made to Abraham, that he would bless all of the nations of earth, all of the families of earth, through Abraham. But Jacob at one point ran afoul of his older brother Esau. Esau wanted to kill him, and so Jacob fled to his uncle Laban's home. While he's at his uncle Laban's home, he ends up married to his two, I guess they would be his cousins, Leah and Rachel. Times were different then, but he marries them, starts having sons with his two wives, Rachel and Leah. They give him their female servants. He begins to have more sons with them as well. And at some point, he runs afoul of his uncle Laban. They kind of have a headbutting issue. And God commands him in Genesis 31, he says, "Return to the land of your fathers and to your kindred, and I will be with you." I will be with you. So Jacob does that. He packs up all of his people, he packs up all of his stuff, some of Laban's stuff as well, and heads back to the land of Canaan where Esau is. Well, at some point he sends out some scouts ahead of him, and they come back and they say, "Hey, Esau has heard that you are coming, and he ain't happy. He's still holding a grudge against you of some kind." So Esau, they say Esau has this army of 400 men with him, and he's angry, and he's coming towards you. He's coming towards you, and he is going to take out some revenge upon you. And that brings us to our account in Genesis chapter 32, starting in verse 22. Where God says, "That same night he arose, he took his two wives, his two female servants, and his 11 children, and he crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream and everything else that he had, and Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, 'Let me go, for the day has broken.' But Jacob said, 'I will not let you go unless you bless me.' And he said to him, 'What is your name?' He said, 'Jacob.' Then he said, 'Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed.' Then Jacob asked him, 'Please tell me your name.' And he said, 'Why is it that you ask my name?' And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, 'For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered.' The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip." This is a Christophany. We talked about these last week. This is a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ, much like we saw the angel of the Lord. And how do we know this is a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ? Well, he refers to himself as God. You have seen God. Jacob refers to him as God, but he has a physical body. He is able to wrestle. And Jesus told us last week in John chapter 6 that no one has seen the face of the God. He doesn't say no one except Jacob. He says no one has seen God. And so here, this is a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ. And it's kind of an interesting and unusual account that Jesus would come and wrestle with Jacob. And again, that's just kind of an odd account as to why he would do that. Why would this happen? What can we possibly learn about Jesus from this account? And I pray that we'll learn a couple of things. I want to make some notes first before we get into what this account might reveal about Jesus. The first thing I want to notice, and again, Joe pointed this out as well, is that it is Jesus who initiates this encounter. It's not that Jacob was out seeking after Jesus, seeking after God. He didn't go and try to find God and engage God in this wrestling match. No, he's there by himself, by the side of this river, and a man, Jesus, comes to him and engages him, and they wrestle. It is Jesus who initiates this encounter. And isn't that just the nature of God? Isn't that the nature of God? God is transcendent. He is high and lifted up. He is separate from his creation. He is above and beyond and independent of his creation. But at the same time, he is immanent. He is intimately involved with his creation. He is personally committed to and involved and engaged with his creation. And are you ever closer or more engaged with somebody than when you wrestle? I can't think of too many more intimate activities than wrestling. When you are wrestling with somebody, you know everything there is to know about them as you're engaged with them. And last week we saw that Hagar, she was by this spring in the wilderness, and she's a young girl, and she's pregnant, and she's been mistreated, and she flees, and she's cowering and sleeping by this spring, and Jesus comes to her, and he engages her. He sees her. He is a God who sees, and he's not content to leave her by this spring by herself. He comes to her and initiates an engagement with her. And we see the exact same thing here. We see Jacob. He's by himself. He's sent everybody over the river. He sent his children, his wives, his servants, all of his stuff is on the other side of the river. He's by himself. Completely by himself, cowering, sleeping on the side of this river. Jesus is not content to leave him there. Jesus comes to him and engages him. He wrestles him. What does it mean to wrestle with God? What does that mean to even wrestle with God? How would we wrestle with God? Why would we wrestle with God? We saw last week that Jesus is a God who sees us. He is a God who sees us. By the way, that was amazing. Brother, I mean, he wrote that song, by the way, that last song. Last night, I got a message at like 1 in the morning. I didn't see it till this morning, saying, hey, I made this song up and wrote it last night, or 2 in the morning, I don't know. And he made that up. I'm like, wow, that's amazing. I'm really hate people who have that kind of skill, because I don't have that kind of talent or skill. But yeah, I'm waiting for an album. He's got like 3 or 4 songs that are pretty amazing. That's my new favorite song, by the way. And so, but we saw last week that Jesus is a God who sees us. And what does it mean that he sees us? But that he sees right into our hearts, and he sees what is most important to us. He sees into our hearts, and he sees the foundation of our identity. He sees the part of our heart that we fence off and try to keep to ourselves. He sees the part of our heart that we cherish and value, and the place that we find our worth and our value. And he sees that in our hearts. He demands that we surrender that to him, and then he calls us to move in opposition to that. Last week he saw Hagar by the spring, and he saw into her heart. He could see that she was cherishing the fact that she was pregnant, that she was with child, and Sarah was not, and the contempt that developed in her mind and her heart, in her pride. And he demanded that she surrender that in return and submit to Sarah. That was the call. And here we see him. He sees Jacob by this river, Jabbok. He knows him. He sees into his heart. He goes to him. He engages him, and he demands of him that he surrender that which is most valuable to him. And we're going to talk about that. But even now, there are those in this room that are wrestling with God. How do I know that? Because I'm one of them. I've been wrestling with God for some time now. I wrestle with God all the time. I keep thinking he's going to get tired. He's God. He's not going to get tired. But even now, I suspect there are others wrestling with God in this room. And isn't this the character of God? That he would see us wherever we are, and he would not be content to leave us wherever we are, but that he would pursue us, that he would seek us out and engage us on the things that are most valuable and important to us aside from him. This is a good thing. We ought to rejoice in it. We'll see that it could be a hard thing. It can be a painful thing, but we ought to rejoice in this. This is a good thing. Let's get back to the crippler for just a second. It occurred to me that I have learned infinitely more in defeat than I have ever learned in victory. I mean, I'm like anybody. In my life, I've had highs and lows. I've had good and bad. I've had, ups and downs. But I have learned infinitely more about myself, about God, about life, about reality, about the world in my defeats than I have ever learned in any victories. So the crippler makes it to the finals, and so Darian and I are scouting out his competition, and we see this guy, and his name is Mumal. That's his last name. Is that right, Mumal? And we see him. He's kind of got like horn-rimmed glasses on. He kind of looks kind of nerdy, and I'm like, this kid's nerdy. Memphis is going to crush this guy. He's going to win the thing. Then Mumal takes off his glasses. He's got like a buzz cut, and he takes his jacket off, and he's kind of ripped. And we're like, oh, this guy looks serious. Maybe this is going to be an issue. And you know, the problem with wrestling, a sport like wrestling, no matter how good you are, you always run into somebody eventually, inevitably, who's better than you. And wrestling is one of those sports where, I don't know if anybody has been in practice. I mean, they start kids at like the age of 4. I mean, literally. I think Mumal must have been one of these kids. He wore Memphis out. I mean, he turned him every which way but loose. I mean, he wiped the mat with Memphis. I mean, we joke about it, but at one point, he like had him by the neck and the ankles and was like literally like scrubbing the mat with Memphis's face. I mean, it was awful. Darren and I were up out there watching like, oh, that's painful. Oh, but I tell you what, Memphis never quit. He never gave up. Not once. He did not relinquish. He didn't get pinned, and he fought with everything that he had. But when it was over, and Mumal raised his hand in victory, I thought I was going to have to scrape Memphis off the mat. I mean, he was a pile of a man. He was a shadow of his former self. He come limping off the mat. His knee had been hurt again, and his face was bloody. I mean, he was bloody. Mumal had bloodied him, and he couldn't even talk in his defeat, so soundly had he been defeated. And he's just crumpled on the side of the stand, sitting there, and all I could do was kind of pat him on the shoulder and say, y'all, he can't even speak. So soundly was he defeated. But I tell you what, Memphis went on to place second in the state in junior varsity in his weight class. And I guarantee you, he learned infinitely more in that defeat than he did any of his easier victories beforehand. I guarantee you, he learned more, infinitely more. And so, as hard as that was, he should rejoice that he met Mumal. Hopefully we won't run into Mumal again, or maybe he wants a rematch at some point in time. I don't know. We'll see. Want a rematch, Memphis? And anyway, so Jesus is the initiator. And what this encounter reveals to us is a couple things. I want us to notice 3 things that this reveals to us. First of all, this reveals in Jesus' relentless pursuit of us, it reveals our weakness. Our absolute weakness. What is it but the illusion of strength, the illusion of our own ability, the illusion of the power of our own will that deters us from fully immersing ourselves in God, from completely surrendering to Him. Consider Jacob who he was. He was the deceiver from birth. I mean, he comes out birth. Esau is born first. He's the firstborn, which meant a lot in those days. But Jacob has a hold of his heel. His father Isaac names him Jacob, which means he cheats. Deceiver. I can think of a better name than that. I'm not sure why he named him that, but better than Brad, I guess. But anyway, so he is a deceiver from birth, and he is true to that. At some point later on, as he's grown up, he cheats Esau out of his birthright. He sells him a bowl of food for his birthright. He capitalizes on Esau's weakness and greed. He could have just given him the food. And again, a birthright doesn't mean much to us today. In our context, it meant a lot then. At some point later, Isaac is on his deathbed, and he's preparing to issue the blessing to his oldest Esau, which again is an important and extremely valuable thing for them. And Esau goes out to hunt. Jacob dresses up like Esau and tricks the elder Isaac into blessing him. He is the deceiver. And that's why Esau wanted to kill him. So he flees to his uncle Laban. And even while he's working for his uncle Laban, at some point he starts to manipulate the flocks of livestock that he's keeping, the sheep, so that his flock will expand and his uncle Laban's flock will diminish. He acquires wealth through deception with his uncle Laban. And that's one of the reasons he felt led to flee from his uncle Laban. And then here he is by the river Jabbok. And even still, he's sending out people ahead of him. He hears that Esau's coming. And so he sends his people out with gifts to try to bribe Esau, to soften his anger. Again, he's relying on himself. He's attempting to deceive Esau once more. But God has brought him to this place whereby he is powerless. He's powerless by the river Jabbok. He's all by himself. Esau is coming with an army of 400 men to kill him. He's completely helpless. He has nothing that he can do. And Jesus comes to him. And what does Jesus do? Does he come and slay Esau and the army of 400 men? No. He comes and engages Jacob all night. And then what does he do at the conclusion? But cripple him further, as if things weren't helpless enough, as if things weren't hard enough already. He strikes him in the hip, dislocates his hip. Now Jacob cannot even run away from Esau, even if he wants to. This encounter reveals our absolute weakness, that Jesus is relentless in pursuing us and explaining to us and in showing us and in teaching us our weakness, our helplessness, that we might surrender to him any illusions of control that we might have. We like control. We love control. We like to be in charge. We like to rely on our own strength. We like to be the captains of our own destiny. We like to shape events and forge circumstances to meet our expectations. We're Americans. We're self-reliant. That's what we do, right? But Jesus is relentless in pursuing us and revealing our own weakness to us. At the same time, conversely, he is relentless in pursuing us and revealing to us his strength. Let me give you some scripture. 2 Corinthians chapter 5. Chapter 2. I love these verses. These are from Paul. Paul says, "For I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified, and I was with you in weakness, and in fear and much trembling, and my speech and my message were not plausible words of wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit of power, so that your faith might not rest in the wisdom of men." We don't want our faith to rest in the wisdom and strength of men, but in the power of God. Listen to what he says in 2 Corinthians chapter 2. He says in verse 5, he says, "Though I should not boast except of my own weakness." Paul had a thorn in the flesh. We don't know what his thorn in the flesh was. I think he had kidney stones. I don't know why I think that, but he had a thorn in the flesh that we don't know what it was. And he begged God 3 times to take this thorn in the flesh from him, to take this weakness from him. And God said no. God said no. He said to him, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." My grace is sufficient for you, but my power is made perfect in weakness. That we might become like David in the verses we read to open the service, who says, "This God is my strong refuge. God is my strength." We could be like Joel in chapter 3, verse 10 of the book of Joel, where he says, "I have become a warrior by the strength of God." So Jesus is relentless in revealing to us our weakness, our helplessness, and his strength. And what can be our response to that? How do we respond to that? But like Jacob here, who yields to him and just clings to him. I can envision Jacob on the ground in the dirt, and he's been bloodied and beaten by Jesus, and he's just clinging to the feet of Jesus, saying, "I won't let go of you, Jesus. I yield to you, and I won't let go." Jesus is relentless in revealing those things to us. But lastly, I want to spend a few minutes here. What I think is most important is that Jesus is relentless in revealing to us our identity. Our identity through his identity. How do you identify? That's a question that like 10 years ago wouldn't have made any sense at all. That wouldn't have meant anything 10 years ago. Today, there's a satanic assault upon the very foundations of who we are. That you can decide that you are whoever you want to be. This is a satanic assault upon that which Jesus has declared. Because the bottom line is that Jesus is the one who tells us exactly who we are. And our identity, our perception of ourselves in many ways, it drives how we think. It drives what we do. It drives where we go. It drives the things that we say, how we perceive ourselves. And we should spend most of our lives, or all of our lives, attempting to align how we view ourselves with how God views us, with the things that God God says about us. That's what matters. It's like the theory of gravity. I can deny the theory of gravity all day long, but if I jump down off this thing, I'm going to fall. It's a fact. In much the same way, how Jesus declares who we are is a fact, is as much of a fact as the theory of gravity. I want you to notice a couple things. We're going to make some observations from Scripture here. Let's go all the way back to Genesis chapter 28. Verse 13. This is God speaking to Jacob in a dream in Genesis 28:13. And I want you to notice how God references himself, or how Jesus, or how Jacob speaks about God previously. Genesis 28:13, God says, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. Genesis 28:13. I'm the God of Abraham your father, the God of Isaac. Genesis 31:42, Jacob says, if the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had not been on my side, he's talking about the God of my father, the God of Abraham, the God of the fear of Isaac. Genesis 32, verse 9, Jacob says, O God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, O Lord. You notice a commonality there. He is the God of Abraham. He's the God of Isaac. Then there's this event by the river Jabbok. There's this wrestling match that occurs by the river. And then I like in the end of chapter 33, it says, there he erected an altar and called it Eli Elohei Israel, which means God, the God of Israel. He was the God of Abraham. He was the God of Isaac. Now he is the God of Israel. Listen to Genesis 35, verse 3. Listen to how he speaks about God in Genesis chapter 35, verse 3 says, let us arise, go up to Bethel, so that I may make there an altar to God, who answers me in the day of my distress, and has been with me wherever I have gone. How did he answer him in his distress? But come to him and wrestle with him and strike him and cripple him and teach him of his own weakness and of the strength of Jesus. That's how, but he came to him in his distress and has been with him wherever he has gone. Notice how he has changed, how he has spoken to him. Genesis chapter 48, verse 15. Listen to how he's getting close to the end of his life now, and he's preparing to bless his sons. And he says, the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life long to this day. Do you see the change that has occurred? Do you see there was this beforehand? He saw he was the God of Abraham. He was the God of Isaac. There was this great struggle with Jesus. And then all of a sudden he becomes his God. And the point here is, in this struggle, there's transformation. There's a transformation. There's an exchange that happens. And there is always a struggle with transformation. You see, the flesh does not die willingly. The old man does not willingly just go to the grave. Our sin does just not peacefully die. As we're nailing it to the cross, it's fighting to get off the cross. It wants to live. It does not go gently into that good night. There is always struggle with transformation. But in the transformation, we got to rejoice in the struggle. Because at some point, when you become a Christian, when you're saved, God, he adopts you as a son of God. He adopts you as a daughter of the King. That is a fact. From that point forward, it's like your children. You know, when you have children from birth, that's your son, that's your daughter from birth. Whether they know it or not, whether they realize it or not. But then you spend time, you pour into them to teach them that they are, in fact, your son. They are your daughter. These are how my sons and daughters will conduct themselves. This is how we will think. This is how we will believe. This is what we will do. In much the same way that we are children of God from the moment of salvation, he spends the rest of our lives in sanctification teaching us to believe that that is actually who we are. And the issue is that we have an enemy. We have an enemy that desperately wants to convince us otherwise. The world and the enemy and our own flesh collude in teaching and attempting to teach us what is not true. That you are not, in fact, a child of God. That you're not a son of God. That you are not a daughter of the King. But we see right here that in this struggle, in this wrestling match, that Jesus is faithful to pursue us. He's not going to let you sit by the river and think something else of yourself. He's not going to let you be by the spring and think that you are anything else than His. He is going to come to you. He is going to see you. He's going to see what is in your heart that you cherish the most. He's going to see the very foundation of the essence of you, and He is going to come to you and demand that you surrender that to Him. And then He is going to call you to move in opposition to that. And so my question today is, what is it that you are wrestling with? What part of your heart are you keeping to yourself? And we can see that this could be quite a painful encounter. I mean, this account kind of sanitizes it a little bit. It just says a man came and struggled with Jacob and all night and struck him on the hip and dislocated his hip. I mean, this sanitizes it a little bit. Wrestling is a violent sport. I mean, I think of Memphis as he came off the mat after that encounter with Mumal. He looked like he had been in a battle. Literally. And so I can envision this struggle by this river Jabbok. And I can see the violence of this struggle. It's painful, but it's necessary. It's painful, but it's infinitely valuable. It's painful, but it's irreplaceable. It's hard. Some of the things in our hearts that we keep from Jesus have been there for decades, for our entire lives. And so it's not easy to have those things ripped out of your heart. And that's what makes Jesus so challenging, is that He comes to us and He demands that we surrender those things, and that in faith we move in opposition to those things. Jesus is relentless in revealing to us our weakness, His strength. He's relentless in revealing to us who we are in Him. Who we are in Him. My prayer is that we would believe it today. That we would believe it today. Last question we'll ask is, how long? I'm going to pray here in a minute. Joe's going to come and sing. Time of response. How long? How long will we wrestle? That is the question that we must ask ourselves. Some of you, again, I talked about it last week, but 2 Fridays ago, I shared my testimony to Celebrate Recovery. I've shared my testimony a ton of times, but this is the first time I shared my testimony. The good, the bad, and the ugly. And there's a lot of ugly there. I wrestled with God about a certain particular thing for 12 years. After my salvation, I wrestled with God. I fought Him tooth and nail. This is a thing that had been a part of my life since I was a boy. And I couldn't imagine life without it. And yet He was relentless in pursuing me to surrender this aspect of myself. He was not content to leave me by the river Jabbok. He was not content to leave me cowering by this spring like Hagar, the young slave girl. He came to me. He saw me. He is a God who sees us. He sees into our hearts. And He demands that we surrender all of it to Him. All of it to Him. And it was a dreadfully painful encounter. But there was transformation in the struggle. I have been transformed by the struggle. I have been taught that I am a son of God. And I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. I'm so thankful. I rejoice that Jesus is who He is and that He pursues us relentlessly. So my question today is, how long? Somebody here is struggling with something today. Somebody here is struggling with God about something today. How long will you struggle? Maybe God's calling you to take action. Maybe God's calling you to do something. Maybe God's calling you to move. Maybe God's calling you to surrender something. Maybe God's calling you to go somewhere. Whatever that may be, my prayer is that we would ask ourselves the question, how long? And the answer today would be no longer. No longer. That we would not wrestle with God any longer, and we would be like Jacob and just cling to his leg and say, bless me, Lord Jesus. Bless me, Lord. Would you pray with me? Lord, we love you. We praise you. We praise you for your word that speaks loud and clear, God. Your word that penetrates to our hearts like a two-edged sword that is living and active. God, I'm thankful for this. And God, I pray that even now the Spirit is moving in the hearts of the people. God, the Spirit's moving in my heart. I feel it. And I rejoice in that. God, that you would see us. That you, the God of the universe, the creator of all things, would see us. God, that you who are high and lifted up, you who are all powerful, you who are all knowing, you who are ever present, God, that you would see me. I can't fathom it. It's beyond me. I don't understand it, God. But I believe it because I know it. And God, I personally want to surrender today. God, I submit to you in joy. I'm thankful for the struggle. I rejoice in the struggle. And so, God, I relinquish to you today that which you have set it upon my heart to relinquish. God, I release it to you. I surrender. God, I pray that even today that you are moving in the hearts of somebody here today, even a single person that has something in their heart that they're keeping to themselves. Maybe it's financial security, whatever that may be, that today would be the day of freedom as you release us. It's freedom.